thank you all for joining me tonight. I appreciate you giving up some of your time this evening. And I hope that you learned something and something that you can take action on so that you can ensure your health and just optimal longevity going forward. So the 7 blood tests for cardiovascular disease that you should have by the age of 40 that your doctor probably hasn't run, unless you are seeing a functional medicine doctor. Whoops, let's see. There we go. All right. So as one of the people I follow quite a bit on his podcast is Peter Attia. Maybe you've heard of him. One of his famous quotes is, not everybody dies from atherosclerosis, but everyone dies with it. So it is extremely common to have that plaque buildup process happening in our body. We need to be aware of how severe that could be. So this presentation is ideally for anybody with a family history of either heart attack, stroke, any kind of vascular condition, those who have had a history of a cardiac event, a stent bypass, people who have red flags for cardiovascular disease, such as high cholesterol, being diagnosed with prediabetes, diabetes, having angina, having erectile dysfunction, high blood pressure. These are all really good reasons to know what your labs are. And high performers and people under high stress. I have seen, in my career in cardiac rehab, I've seen people come into the program who we had no other risk factors, but they had just extremely high levels of stress. And then anyone that is really looking to identify and lower their cardiovascular risk. So what do you think is the most common presentation or signs or symptoms of someone's first heart attack? The answer is, in half of all cases, it's sudden death. So this is really scary. This is why I want to do this. So I have to keep moving my bar around so I can read these. So heart disease is not something that we necessarily feel or know that we have ahead of time, nor do we always get warning signs that there's a problem. In my years of working in cardiac rehab, I can't tell you how many people came into our program that didn't have any signs. They really, looking back, they couldn't think of anything that they saw as a sign. 50% of men who are going to have a cardiac event in their life will have it before the age of 65. So this is not an elderly person's disease. Almost 25% of these are in men younger than 54. So that's like, as I start getting into this age category, I'm like, these are my peers. This is real. And then for women, a third will have their first cardiac event before the age of 65. So it is not an old person's disease. I mean, I guess if you're 20, then that seems like an old person, but the sad reality is that cardiovascular disease it has been and continues to be the #1 killer and one of the most likely diseases or conditions to steal our health and happiness. It contributes to strokes, heart attacks, even many forms of dementia are related to cardiovascular disease. And it's why many people end up in nursing homes. They have to retire early and just their quality of life just tanks. And cardiovascular disease actually starts as soon as we're born. Autopsies have revealed that fatty streaks occur in children. It's an insidious process. It develops over time. And sadly, the first symptom is often a catastrophic heart attack. MI is heart attack or stroke. So we want to know if we're at risk. So a bit about me. So I have more than 25 years of working in cardiac rehabilitation. So I am a registered clinical exercise physiologist with a master's degree in clinical exercise physiology. I'm also board certified as a functional medicine wellness coach. And I have 10 years of experience working as a wellness coach and over 3 years working as in the functional medicine realm. I'm also a certified heart math practitioner, and I'm a major lover of cheese. So we can do better. This is why I'm so passionate about this, because it doesn't have to be this way. There are things that we can do to really address whether or not we're at risk. So there are tests that your doctor can order, but may not be because they may not simply not know about these tests. In many cases, doctors' offices are so overburdened. They have quota that they have to meet. They're not able to spend the time that they need to spend with patients. It's not their fault, but they don't have the time to go out and get this advanced education that a lot of functional medicine doctors have. So it's important that we educate them. It's not a blame game. It's just a matter of just information is not there. The sooner we can get these tests and address what we find on these tests, the better we can, the better chance we have of making changes. It's not good enough to wait until we're 50, and it's not good enough to wait until we have symptoms. The sooner, the better. So traditional testing, doctors typically think about cardiovascular disease as having two main paths. Aside from smoking, which is obviously an independent risk factor all by itself. But otherwise, they think of cardiovascular disease as having two main pathways to disease: hypertension and lipid abnormalities. So high blood pressure puts stress on the arterial wall, the endothelial lining of the arteries, and that stress over time causes damage to the lining of the artery. And that's where the cholesterol is brought into repair. So cholesterol is a repair agent, and it's, the HDL or the LDL cholesterol transports the cholesterol into the artery wall to repair the damage that's done. But the cholesterol didn't cause the damage. So high blood pressure is definitely an independent risk factor that needs to be treated. Optimal is less than 115/75. Lipid abnormalities, do contribute to cardiovascular disease. When we say lipids, we're talking about what a lot of people think of as blood fats. The basic testing for lipids is can identify for red flags. If you have a really, if you have a high triglyceride, if you have a really high cholesterol, really high LDL, then those are red flags. We want to know more, but in and of themselves, they're not enough. There's not enough information to really identify our level of risk. So it is generally, from a functional medicine perspective, it's not okay to just do what insurance companies pay for. So they do an okay job of addressing red flags, addressing if blood pressure is an issue, but even blood pressure checks aren't a perfect assessment, especially if they're basically using the blood pressures that they get when you come into the office. White coat syndrome is a real thing. People can have very high blood pressure just sitting in the doctor's office when the rest of the time their blood pressure is perfectly fine. So unless they're doing ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, a blood pressure check in the office is not an optimal assessment. Treatment for blood pressure is most often, like the doctors may say, I'll give you 3 months to get your blood pressure down on your own. And if it's not down, next time you come in, you're going to be put on a medication. And that's not really fair because patients aren't really given the information that they need to truly address blood pressure at the root cause. So in blood pressure management, it's almost always a medication issue. And then there's side effects to medications. Lipid panel, again, the basic panel can identify if there are red flags. But they're going to if you have high levels, they're not going to look any deeper. They're just going to put you on a statin and send you on your way. And statins have their own list of side effects. They serve a role, and there are certain people who definitely benefit from being on them, but I think that they're used far too often. And then being the statin, the high use of statins hasn't made that much of a difference in the rate of cardiovascular disease. Oops, I went to the wrong way. So we must take a deeper dive. There's room for improvement, and there are several tests that are missing in a normal, the normal process of identifying risk factors that we can turn to. So there are 4 areas that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the advanced testing for lipids, the advanced testing for metabolic health, the testing for inflammation, and then we're not going to go into genetics. There's a lot of testing that you can have done to look at genetic markers, and that can help a functional medicine provider be able to sort of tailor an approach to really helping with the effect on that level, on the genetic level, looking at different deficiencies and so forth, but that's not something that we're going to go over here. And it's not something that I necessarily spend a lot of time on as a coach. All right, so diving into the lipids. So as I said, most practices do okay with checking it for the basic red flag. It is important to know what those levels are, the basic triglycerides, total cholesterol, HDL, and LDL. But we want to know more. And even people that since we put people on statins, we haven't reduced the rates of cardiovascular disease all that much. And then there are people who can have low levels, like you can look at their normal triglyceride, total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, and everything looks reasonably okay. And you think, okay, this person's fine. They probably don't need to have a statin, but they may actually be, there may be some things that we miss in those cases because we're not looking at a deeper dive. We're not looking at the particle size and number of those HDL and LDL values. So we really need to know more. So what can we do differently? What can we add? So LP little a is a really important number to measure. There's just no question when you look at the literature that people who have higher levels of LP little a are at much higher risk of cardiovascular disease. There's not a lot you can do lifestyle-wise to lower this value. There are some people out there who have some anecdotal evidence about different supplements that can be taken, some different amino acids that can be taken that can potentially lower LP little a. But it's important to know if that's high for us, because then we know that it's even more important that we get all of our other levels into ideal range. So it's not a death sentence. It's just this is something that's putting you at advanced risk. So what can you do with all of your other areas to lower your risk? Because there are so many things we can do. There's not just one thing there. We have to look at it as a whole. And then ApoB is it's basically a look at the LDL, the harmful LDL levels that are circulating. So it's looking at LDL, oxidized LDL. It's looking at the very low density and the chylomicrons, which are smaller LDL particles. And this helps us to know when we take a basic LDL, the ApoB tells us how much of the LDL is actually harmful, because LDL serves a role in the body. Why would we have it? Why would our body have LDL cholesterol if it was all bad? I mean, if you think about it from a nature perspective, like there's a reason for LDL. And in all of my years of working in cardiac rehab, we just saw it as a bad thing. And there's nothing inherently in the body that's bad. But things get labeled bad because they're not fully understood. So LDL transports cholesterol all throughout the body, where it's used to build cells, to make hormones, and to make bile acids for digestion. There's so many things that we need it for. And LDL transports it around the body, and it transports it into the blood vessels, and it does put it into the vessel wall where there has been damage. So it's kind of like blaming the firefighters for the house fire. They're there to put the fire out. They didn't cause the fire. LDL is there to repair the damage to artery walls, but it didn't cause the damage, in the exception of some of these particles. So there can be these particle sizes. The small, dense LDL are like little BBs. And you can think of those like little BBs that are getting shot into the side of your artery wall. So there's large fluffy LDL. Those are the ones that are fine. They transport the cholesterol around the body where it's used. They don't do any damage. And then there's the small dense, and they're like little BBs getting shot into the side, to the wall of your artery. So you want to know what percentage of your LDL is small dense and what percentage of it is large fluffy. Because I don't want to take a statin if most of my LDL is large fluffy. So those are the important things to know. We want to have a better understanding of all of this and have be able to have those LDLs calculated to understand, truly understand if it's a predictor of elevated risk. Okay, metabolic health. So this is something that has become more and more important to me as I spent so much time in cardiac rehab seeing people who were basically doing everything that we thought was the right thing to do, but it was a revolving door of cardiac events. They would come, they would have their heart attack, they'd come to cardiac rehab, they would get a little bit fitter, they would we hardly ever had anyone lose weight in cardiac rehab. It never happened. But they would, they get a little bit better, they'd increase their exercise a little bit. And we would make sure they were taking all their medications like good boys and girls. But they would be back. They would do their 3 months of cardiac rehab, and then a year later, we'd see them back again. And I started seeing this happening in younger people who had ideal, like optimized cholesterol levels based on the basic screening, right? Not the advanced screening. They had normal cholesterol, low cholesterol, even low blood pressure. They weren't overweight. They didn't smoke. They weren't diabetic. And yet they kept coming back into cardiac rehab. And I just was like, this is not okay. We can't just accept that this is just the way it is. Like, and doctors will just tell them, well, you just have bad genes. That's just the way it is. And I just was not okay with that. And I kept trying to figure out what we were missing. And I started going down all these rabbit holes. And that's when I discovered functional medicine and went back to school. And I learned all about how actually our blood sugar and our insulin levels are a bigger risk factor and actually cause more damage to our arteries than cholesterol. So looking at both metabolic health, how do we process sugar? How good is our body at being able to process sugar? Looking at, and we're going to talk about inflammation. So insulin resistance is probably one of the biggest things to know about when it comes to your cardiovascular health. Insulin resistance means how well do your cells respond to the insulin that's circulating around. So when you have some glucose in your diet and your body secretes out insulin in response to the glucose, do those cells readily respond to the insulin and allow the blood sugar to come out of the blood and into the cell, or are they resistant? And so that insulin resistance happens over time because the cells have gotten so packed full of glucose that they can't accept anymore. They're just like an overpacked suitcase that you can't get any more clothes into. And so they become resistant. They're like, there's no more room in this cell. We're full of sugar. So this is something that happens over time, and people don't necessarily have any symptoms of it other than they're starting to gain more and more weight. They may have blood sugars that are just hovering below the mark where it's considered diabetic. And so they go years having blood sugars like just under 100 or just under 110 or whatever cutoff you're using. But they're high, they're high, they're in the normal range, but they're in the high end of normal. And the general medical community doesn't do anything until they're over there, until they finally jump over that threshold into diabetic range. And so you're not diabetic, not diabetic. Oh, actually now you're diabetic. So a lot can be done to address that trend and to deal with the insulin resistance and to correct it before it actually becomes full-blown diabetes. The longer you go with diabetes, then you're going to start having additional issues in your body that are going to be harder to correct. So when we can catch it early, we can actually reverse diabetes. We can basically, it can go away. Insurance practices, they will allow for certain tests. Most insurance practices do okay with testing basic glucose. They might check an A1C, but typically they only check A1C if you have been diagnosed with prediabetes. So they're not going to check an A1C in a normal non-diabetic person. So they typically only take action when the trends are starting to push you over the threshold and once a diagnosis is made. But you could be building up to full-blown diabetes. You could be having damage to your artery walls with all that fasting, all that high glucose, all those high insulin, the high insulin circulating through your arteries. And that can be going on for years. So we need to know these numbers. So what can we add? So glycomark is a somewhat newer test that can be done. And this is evaluating for excessive spikes in blood glucose, which can be worse and more damaging than just an elevated average, which is what the A1C tests for. So an A1C is a test that looks at basically the last 3 months of your average glucose. And a glycomark is going to assess more for the excessive spikes. So it's gonna tell us, how does a person do in terms of tolerating a meal? Do they have a big spike after a meal? That's important to know, because that can actually be more damaging to the inside of the artery wall and cause that plaque buildup to start versus just a high average blood sugar. A C-peptide also evaluates for general insulin levels over time. Uric acid can give us some idea of how the liver is doing in terms of fructose consumption. So when we eat too much fructose, which we all know that that's going to be in a lot of sodas and sweetened beverages, a lot of processed foods, even people that eat just excessive amounts of fruit or drink fruit juice. So fructose is, the liver has to break that down, it has to process it into glucose. And when it's getting too much of that, it can increase uric acid, which is known to increase blood pressure, which then can damage the lining of the arteries. So these are all things that we can be taking a look at to get a better idea of somebody's risk. We can also do a HOMA score, which is a calculation based on your average blood glucose and your insulin level. So I'm not sure how they do the calculation, but you can actually go online and just Google HOMA score. And if you have your fasting glucose and you have your fasting insulin level, you just type those two values in and it'll give you a score. And that's a really good measure as well, because it's those two levels can do a lot of damage to the inside of the artery wall. So we want them both low. But if you put those numbers in, it'll tell you what your overall score is. And then fasting insulin, this can be something that is maybe a little easier for your doctor to order. It's still not done as a standard, and I don't understand why, because it's such a simple thing to add to your test. But fasting insulin has a really good correlator to cardiovascular risk. And then heart rate variability. This is not a lab test. This is something I do as a heart math practitioner. Heart rate variability is the difference in timing between each heartbeat over time. So normal our heart rate variability, we want to be high. And if you think about if your heart beats 60 beats a minute, it's not actually beating exactly on the nose 60 beats a minute. There are millisecond differences between each heartbeat. And so the extent or the quantity, the amount of difference between those beats, as well as the pattern of change, are two indicators of our nervous system balance. So when we have good heart rate variability and we have good heart rate variability coherence, which is an organized pattern of the timing between beats, meaning that when I look at it on a graph, when I have somebody hooked up, there's this nice sine wave, nice even sine wave showing me that their heart rate variability, they're having a gradual speeding up and a gradual slowing down in milliseconds. So it's not something we can measure visually. So I test this with people and I can get an idea of how balanced they are in their nervous system. People who are really in the sympathetic nervous system, who are kind of chronically in fight or flight, flight or freeze, we now say, that is going to really increase their cardiovascular risk. So there's a lot of research on heart rate variability and how it correlates to cardiovascular risk. We really want to be in the parasympathetic, the rest and digest. It's important that we have the ability to get into sympathetic when we need to. That's action taking mode. That's, being a decision maker and taking action, but we need to be able to shift into parasympathetic when it's not time to take action. So it's an important thing to know. All right, inflammation. So inflammation is rarely evaluated by insurance-based practices. I have actually even had patients go in and ask their doctor to measure for inflammation, and the doctor says, no, it's not indicated, which is ridiculous, because why wouldn't you want to know? And I just think maybe they didn't know what to do with the information when they got it. Inflammation is it's part of what damages the artery wall and allows those fats, the cholesterol, to go into the artery wall in the first place. So again, cholesterol is not necessarily, unless you have a high number of those small dents, those little BB ones, cholesterol doesn't generally cause the problem, but it is there, and it fills in those the damaged parts of the artery when the damage occurs. And inflammation is a big part of that initial damage to the artery wall. So, without inflammation, the cholesterol generally doesn't cause a problem. Homocysteine is one of the things we can look at for general inflammation. We can also look at an HSCRP, that stands for high sensitivity, and CRP is just too long of a word for me to try to pronounce. But it's a general inflammation marker. So we can see this could be something if someone has recently had a flare-up of an autoimmune condition, or like a rheumatoid arthritis, or they've got some kind of active infection or something going on. We can see high levels of inflammation. A lot of dental problems and oral problems can contribute to this. So whatever's causing it needs to be addressed. That's why they say, dental health is really linked to cardiovascular health now, because we understand that when you have high levels of inflammation, that can become systemic. Ferritin is it's a form of stored iron. And there's a lot of data that shows that ferritin is linked to increased risk, and that people who have been diagnosed or had cardiac events, when their ferritin levels were drawn in the hospital, they were generally elevated. But there's still a lot of question as to whether it's an association or more of a causation. So we're not totally clear about what the actual relationship is between ferritin and heart disease, but there definitely appears to be a link there. So it would be good to know if you have excessively high ferritin. I have had patients where they've had really high ferritin, so they just give blood about every 6 months, and that really drops their ferritin levels. And then there's also the being on the way too low side, and that can be a cause for a lot of other issues just related to not having enough iron in your body. So just a good thing to know. And I only found out that mine was really, really, really low because I became very, very symptomatic and short of breath and weak when I was trying to hike. And there was no other, I was generally very fit otherwise, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. And I asked my doctor to run some tests, and they checked ferritin, and it was extremely, extremely low. And for me, it was because my stomach acid was too low, and I wasn't able to break down my protein and absorb my iron. So it's a good thing to know, because too low and too high can both have issues. So in summary, there's definitely a disparity between the tests that are typically done by an insurance-based practice where, again, these doctors are under high pressure to see patients, to see a certain number of people. They don't have a lot of time. They generally just sort of follow what the traditional insurance model, just the general practice guidelines that they have. So again, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just suggesting that our healthcare model has not been set up to really dive into the true root cause of many of our chronic diseases. So on the traditional side, you're gonna get your basic lipid panel, you're gonna get a fasting blood glucose, you're obviously gonna have your blood pressure checked. These are not perfect measures. They may do an A1C, but it's not likely unless you already have symptoms of diabetes or have already been diagnosed with diabetes. Then those are checked regularly. They should be checked on every adult person. Advanced testing is going to check an ApoB, which is looking at the how much of your LDL is harmful LDL. The LP little a is a measure of another damaging subparticle that we just need to know if we have that, so that we can just be extra cautious and really make sure that we're getting everything else into a tight range. Our fasting glucose, obviously the C-peptide and glycomark to look for general ability to tolerate glucose versus having big spikes after meals. The A1C, which is going to give us an idea of our average glucose over a 3-month period. The high sensitivity CRP and homocysteine, which are going to give us an indication of how much inflammation we have going on in our body. So a lot more information on the advanced testing side of things. I'm so glad that since I've worked in a functional medicine office, I've been able to have all these things done. And so what I'm excited, my LP little a is a little bit high. So I do have to make sure that everything else is in tight range. And so when I had my advanced testing, all of my other measures came back in really good range. And that was being a cheese eater. So I knew that even though I was eating cheese, and they're actually all of the recent studies, and you'll see it in like the Journal of American Cardiology, there is no link between cheese consumption or even saturated fat intake as a whole and cardiovascular disease. It's really looking, it's whether or not we have these are the things we need to know. And just eating saturated fat, unless you are predisposed to having a high number of the harmful LDL, saturated fat is not going to increase cardiovascular risk. So I can't tell you how excited I was to know that, because I do love my goat cheese. All right. So, so questions about any of this, I'm happy to answer questions. You can also reach out to me, go to my website, or just email me. I do have a lab that I can refer to. They have labs all over the country. And so if your doctor kind of looks at you funny and doesn't want to do those labs, or maybe you don't have someone at the moment, I can order. I don't necessarily order. I just basically send you a list of things that I think would be good. And you just basically can order them and pay for them out of pocket at one of these many labs that, again, are all over the country. So happy to help you acquire those labs. So any questions for me?
Any questions?
No.
So I have a question. If
Yeah.
you're diagnosed on one of the tests, either high or low, is it easy to rectify those issues, or is it a long, lengthy process to get it in balance?
So, I mean, that's a great question. I will say I'm not a huge proponent of statins across the board, but there are some cases where statins may be a good solution. And what appears to be the population that appears to have the most benefit from being on a statin are kind of middle age, I would say 40s through 60s men. That population seems to have the most benefit in terms of, a benefit cost ratio. So if it were a relative of mine, and they had high levels of the harmful LDL, I think I would say, like, let's give it 3 months of really, in those populations, I would say we're going to really pull back on the saturated fat. Like, we're going to go toward a lot more plant-based, which I'm a huge fan of plant-based anyway, but I think animal foods, especially when they're grass-fed, grass-finished, wild-caught, pastured, like, they all have a place in our diet. But if it were someone that had those high levels, I might take a little different approach dietary wise and say, let's do this, and let's see what happens in 3 months and see if we're seeing any change. And if not, then maybe it's time to just get on a statin.
So 3 months, 3 to 6 months would be a time frame you'd be looking at.
So 3 to 6 months to see if the needle's moving.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you may not get it exactly where you want it, but to see if you're actually making a change, if you've been really diligent, you'd have to make it a pretty concerted effort. If you're kind of willy-nilly about it, you might not see much change. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay. Well, I appreciate you guys sharing some of your time with me tonight. And if something does come up, if any questions come up later, you're again welcome to reach out on my email, or you can go to my website, which also has my email on there. So happy to answer questions at any point.
Thank you, Angie.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Good
Have a
night.
great night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.